In the summer of 2022, a team of geneticists at the University of Florence published something that should have made international headlines. It should have been plastered across every news outlet, debated in every university, discussed at every dinner table. Instead, it was buried in a specialized scientific journal, discussed only in hushed tones among researchers who understood what they were looking at. What they had found in the ancient DNA extracted from Pompeii's victims was not just unexpected. It was impossible according to everything we thought we knew about Roman Italy. The scientists had managed to extract viable genetic material from the bones and teeth of individuals who died in 79 AD, when Mount Vesuvius erupted and froze an entire city in time. When they sequenced that DNA and compared it to modern Italian populations, something did not add up. Something was fundamentally wrong with the narrative we had all been taught about who the Romans were, where they came from, and how our modern civilization connects to theirs. Roughly 30% of the DNA samples showed genetic markers from the Middle East and North Africa. Now, you might be thinking, well, Rome was a cosmopolitan empire, right? People traveled, people traded, people mixed. That is what we have been told. But here is the problem. The percentage was not just high, it was abnormally high. It was higher than what population models predicted. It was higher than what historical records suggested. And most disturbingly, some of the genetic variants they found were not just Middle Eastern or North African. They were rare markers, the kind you only see in isolated populations that have been cut off from the rest of humanity for thousands of years. When the research team attempted to publish their full dataset, including the complete genetic profiles of all tested individuals, they ran into resistance, not from other scientists, but from cultural institutions. The Vatican raised concerns. Italian heritage organizations pushed back. Even some academics at Italian universities argued that releasing the full genetic information could be misinterpreted, could be used to push nationalist agendas, could undermine the cultural identity of modern Italy. But was that really what they were worried about? Or were they worried about something else entirely? Because buried in that data was a pattern that did not fit anywhere in our understanding of human migration in Europe. Some of those Pompeii victims carried genetic signatures that should not have existed in the Mediterranean in the 1st century AD. Markers that suggested their ancestors had come from populations that modern genetics had not even properly identified yet. It was as if someone had taken people from multiple isolated gene pools, brought them together in one place, and then Vesuvius had preserved that moment forever. One researcher, who spoke on condition of anonymity, described it like this. Imagine you are assembling a puzzle of human migration across Europe over 10,000 years. You have all the pieces. You know how populations moved, mixed, and evolved. Then you find one piece that does not belong to any known puzzle. It fits nowhere. Its edges do not match anything you have ever seen. That is what some of these genetic profiles were like. They were the wrong shape for the timeline. This brings us to a question that mainstream historians desperately want you to ignore. What if Pompeii was not just a Roman city? What if it was something else entirely? What if the people who died there in 79 AD were not the descendants of the Latin tribes who supposedly built Rome from scratch? What if they were something older, something that had been there long before Rome ever existed, and Rome simply built on top of them, absorbed them, and then erased them from history? There is a theory that has been quietly circulating among researchers who are willing to risk their reputations. It is called the last colony hypothesis. The idea is simple but profound. What if modern humanity, everyone alive today, is not the product of a smooth, continuous evolution from ancient civilizations? What if we are actually the survivors, the last colony, the final remnant of something much older and much larger that was almost completely wiped out? Think about what we know from other genetic studies. The entire human population outside of Africa descended from a migration that happened around 70,000 years ago. Before that, there were other human species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus populations scattered across the Old World. They all went extinct, or nearly extinct, leaving only fragments of their DNA in our genomes. But what if there were also advanced human populations, anatomically modern humans like us, who built civilizations that we have no record of? What if catastrophic events, whether natural or otherwise, reduced them to tiny surviving populations that had to rebuild everything from scratch. Pompeii could be a window into one of those moments, a snapshot of a transitional population, people who carried genetic memories of something older, something lost, something that the official narrative of Western civilization has conveniently forgotten. The DNA does not lie. It tells a story of diversity that should not exist in a population that supposedly descended from a small group of Latin farmers who founded Rome in 753 BC. And here is where it gets even stranger. When you map the genetic diversity found in Pompeii against modern populations, the closest matches are not in Italy. They are scattered. Some markers align with populations in the Caucasus Mountains, others with isolated groups in the Atlas Mountains of North Africa. Still others with genetic pockets in the Levant that show signs of ancient isolation. It is as if the people of Pompeii were a genetic crossroads, a meeting point of lineages that had been separated for millennia and then suddenly came back together in one place. Why would that happen? Why would you have this concentration of diverse, ancient genetic lineages in a single Roman city? The conventional explanation is trade and migration, but that does not account for the isolation signatures. Those markers suggest that the ancestors of these people had been cut off from major population flows for thousands of years before somehow ending up in Pompeii. That is not how trade and migration work. That is how intentional population movement works. That is how colonization works. Now, before we go further, I want to make something clear. If you are watching this and thinking, this is exactly the kind of hidden history I have been looking for, the kind that does not make it into the textbooks, then you need to subscribe to Tales Before Tesla right now. Hit that bell icon, because we are going deep into the evidence that mainstream academia does not want you examining too closely. This is not conspiracy theory. This is genetic science. This is archaeology. This is the data they published and then tried to downplay. We are just connecting the dots they want to stay separated. So let us talk about what happens when you actually trace these genetic lines forward. When you look at modern Italian DNA, you do find connections to ancient Pompeii, but not as strongly as you would expect. There has been dilution, mixing, population replacement. The genetic signal from Pompeii is faint in modern Italy, like an echo of something that was once much stronger. But in certain isolated populations around the Mediterranean, the signal is clearer. In Sardinia, in some Greek islands, in mountain communities that have remained relatively isolated for centuries, you find stronger genetic links to the people who died in Pompeii than you do in Rome itself. What does that tell you? It tells you that whatever those people were, whatever ancient lineages they represented, they were pushed to the margins over time. They were replaced, absorbed, or eliminated by successive waves of migration and conquest. The genetic baseline of the Mediterranean shifted, and the people of Pompeii became genetic outliers in their own homeland. Or perhaps it was never their homeland to begin with. Perhaps they were already the last remnants of something older, holding on in a world that was moving past them. The researchers who uncovered this data have been careful, perhaps too careful, in how they present their findings. They use phrases like genetic admixture and population substructure. They talk about migration patterns and trade networks. But if you read between the lines, if you look at the actual numbers, what they are describing is a population that does not fit the model. A population that carries the genetic signature of a bottleneck, a severe reduction in numbers at some point in their history, followed by isolation, and then sudden reintroduction into the broader Mediterranean gene pool right before Vesuvius erupted and ended it all. That is not the story of a thriving Roman city at the height of the empire. That is the story of survivors. That is the story of a last colony. The history books will tell you that Pompeii was a Roman city. They will show you the forums, the amphitheaters, the Latin inscriptions carved into stone. They will tell you about the Roman citizens who lived there, worshipped Roman gods, spoke Latin, and lived under Roman law. And all of that is technically true. But it is also a carefully constructed lie by omission. Because what they do not tell you is what was there before Rome ever showed up. What they do not tell you is that the Romans did not build Pompeii. They inherited it. They occupied it. They rebranded it. And then they systematically erased any evidence that might suggest the city belonged to someone else first. Let us start with the foundations. Literally, When archaeologists excavated beneath the Roman-era structures of Pompeii, they found something that should not exist according to the standard timeline. They found temples, not Roman temples. These were older, much older, built in a style that predates Roman architecture by centuries. The construction techniques were different. The religious symbols were not Roman. The orientation of the buildings did not align with Roman urban planning principles. These were Oscan temples, structures built by the indigenous people of Campania who lived in the region before Rome conquered it. But here is what makes it even more interesting. Beneath those Oscan temples, there were older foundations, Etruscan stonework, Greek pottery fragments, evidence of settlement that goes back not just decades or centuries before Rome, but potentially 1,000 years or more. The stratigraphic layers told a clear story. Pompeii was not a Roman creation. It was a palimpsest, a place where civilization after civilization had built on top of the ruins of what came before, and Rome was just the latest in a long line of occupiers. In 2019, a team of geologists and archaeologists conducted a comprehensive stratigraphic analysis of Pompeii's foundations. What they found was evidence of at least 3 distinct settlement periods before the Roman era. The oldest layer showed signs of habitation dating back to the 8th or 9th century BC, right around the time Rome was supposedly being founded by Romulus and Remus, according to mythology. But while Rome was still a collection of huts on hills, Pompeii already had stone structures, organized streets, and a functioning urban center. It was not a Roman outpost. It was already a city when Rome was barely a village. So why do we not learn this in school? Why do history textbooks gloss over the pre-Roman history of Pompeii and jump straight to the Roman conquest of Campania in 343 BC? The answer is simple. Because admitting that Pompeii was already a sophisticated urban center before Rome arrived would undermine the narrative of Roman exceptionalism. It would force us to acknowledge that Rome did not create Mediterranean civilization. Rome conquered it, absorbed it, and then took credit for it. The Romans were masters of propaganda. They understood that controlling history meant controlling identity. When they conquered a region, they did not just impose military rule, they imposed cultural amnesia. They Latinized place names. They replaced local gods with Roman equivalents. They rewrote foundation myths to suggest that the conquered peoples had always been destined to become part of Rome. And they destroyed or buried any records that contradicted this narrative. We see this pattern everywhere Rome expanded. In Gaul, in Iberia, in Britain, in North Africa. Indigenous cultures with their own writing systems, their own architectural traditions, their own historical records were systematically dismantled. The Romans called it civilization. Modern historians call it Romanization. But what it really was cultural genocide. And Pompeii was no exception. Here is something most people do not know. The language spoken in Pompeii before the Roman conquest was not Latin. It was Oscan, a completely different Italic language with its own alphabet and grammatical structure. Oscan inscriptions have been found throughout Pompeii, but they are almost always in the lower layers of excavation or scratched into walls in places where Romans would not see them. The official public inscriptions, the ones on monuments and government buildings, are all in Latin, but in the private spaces, in homes and back alleys, Oscan survived. The people of Pompeii were bilingual, speaking the conqueror's language in public and their ancestral language in private. Now, this raises an uncomfortable question. If the people of Pompeii maintained their indigenous language in secret, what else did they maintain? What other traditions, what other knowledge, what other histories did they preserve away from Roman eyes? And when Vesuvius erupted and buried the city, how much of that hidden knowledge was lost forever? Pliny the Elder, the famous Roman historian who died during the eruption of Vesuvius, wrote extensively about Campania and the cities around the Bay of Naples. But if you read his accounts carefully, you notice something strange. He barely mentions the pre-Roman history of the region. He talks about Greek colonies like Neapolis and Cumae. He references the Samnite Wars when Rome fought the local tribes, but he never discusses who built the cities in the first place. He never asks where the urban infrastructure came from. He treats it as if it spontaneously appeared the moment Rome arrived. That is not historical amnesia. That is intentional erasure. The same thing happens with other Roman historians. Livy, Tacitus, Suetonius, they all write about Campania, but they frame it as if history began with Roman conquest. Anything before that is dismissed as barbarism, as primitive tribal culture not worth documenting. But the archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. It tells us that the Oscans, the Etruscans, and the Greeks who lived in Campania before Rome had sophisticated societies with advanced engineering, complex trade networks, and their own rich cultural traditions. They were not waiting around to be civilized by Rome. They were already civilized. Rome just had better armies. If you are watching this from Italy, I want you to think about something. Did they teach you any of this in school? Did they tell you that Pompeii was a thriving city before Rome conquered it? Did they mention the Oscan temples buried beneath the Roman forums? Did they explain that the people who died in 79 AD were not ethnically Roman, but descendants of indigenous Campanians who had been forcibly assimilated into the empire? Or did they just show you pictures of Roman ruins and leave it at that? Drop a comment and let me know, because I am genuinely curious how much of this history gets buried even today. The Romans had a specific strategy for erasing pre-Roman history. They would build their own structures directly on top of conquered sites. Roman temples would be constructed over indigenous sacred spaces. Roman roads would pave over ancient pathways. Roman aqueducts would reroute water from systems that had been functioning for centuries. And then, after a few generations, people would forget that anything else had ever been there. The landscape itself became Roman propaganda. In Pompeii, we see this everywhere. The Forum, the political and commercial heart of the Roman city, was built directly over an earlier Oscan marketplace. The Temple of Jupiter, one of the most prominent Roman religious sites in Pompeii, sits on foundations that predate Roman occupation by at least 200 years. The amphitheater, often celebrated as one of the oldest surviving Roman amphitheaters in the world, was actually a renovation of an earlier Oscan structure. The Romans did not invent these spaces. They rebranded them. And this is where the lie becomes truly insidious. By claiming credit for pre-existing infrastructure, Rome created the illusion that civilization in Italy began with Roman expansion. It allowed them to position themselves as the origin point of Western culture, rather than what they actually were, which was a militaristic empire that conquered and absorbed older civilizations. The myth of Rome as the cradle of civilization depends entirely on ignoring or erasing everything that came before it. But the evidence is still there, buried beneath the volcanic ash, waiting to be excavated. Every time archaeologists dig deeper into Pompeii, they find more proof that the Roman narrative is incomplete at best and deliberately deceptive at worst. They find inscriptions in languages Rome tried to suppress. They find architectural techniques that Romans did not use. They find religious artifacts dedicated to gods that Rome never officially recognized. And they find genetic evidence, like the DNA we discussed earlier, that proves the people of Pompeii were not Roman colonists transplanting their culture to a blank landscape. They were indigenous people living under Roman occupation, maintaining their own identities as best they could under imperial rule. So when we talk about Pompeii, we are not just talking about a city that was destroyed by a volcano. We are talking about a city whose true history was destroyed by an empire long before the volcano ever erupted. And that destruction, that erasure, that rewriting of history to serve the interests of the powerful, that is the real Roman legacy, not the aqueducts or the roads or the legal system. The legacy is the lie. The legacy is the belief that history began when Rome decided it did, and everything before that does not matter. But it does matter, because the people who lived in Pompeii before it was Roman, they had their own stories, their own knowledge, their own place in the long history of human civilization. And wherever you are right now, whether you are listening to this at 3 in the morning because you cannot sleep, or during your commute, or while you are working, I want you to drop a comment. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. Because this story, this hidden history, it belongs to all of us. It crosses borders and time zones. And I genuinely want to know how far this message is reaching, how many people are starting to question the narratives we have all been taught. We owe it to those forgotten people to tell the truth. Here is something that should bother you. The Romans were not idiots. They were brilliant engineers, meticulous record keepers, and obsessive observers of natural phenomena. They understood hydraulics, they tracked astronomical events, they documented weather patterns. Strabo, the famous geographer, had written about volcanic activity in the Mediterranean. Vitruvius discussed the properties of volcanic soil in his architectural treatises. The Romans knew what volcanoes were. They knew that mountains could explode. They knew that fire could come from beneath the earth. So, why did nobody in Pompeii see it coming? Mount Vesuvius had been quiet for centuries before 79 AD, so quiet that people had forgotten it was even a volcano. Vineyards covered its slopes. Wealthy Romans built vacation villas with views of the mountain. The soil was incredibly fertile, perfect for growing grapes and olives. To the people living in its shadow, Vesuvius was not a threat. It was a resource. It was real estate. It was the backdrop to their comfortable lives. And then, on what most historians believe was October 24th, 79 AD, it killed them all. But here is the first problem with that date. In 2020, archaeologists discovered a charcoal inscription on a wall in Pompeii that completely upended the timeline. The graffiti was dated to October 17th. Just a casual scrawl, the kind of thing someone might write while bored or waiting around. Nothing special about it except for one detail. It was written after the date that Pliny the Younger claimed the eruption happened. For over 300 years, historians had accepted Pliny's account that Vesuvius erupted on August 24th. That was the established date. That was what every textbook said. And then one piece of charcoal graffiti proved it was wrong. So the eruption happened in October, not August. That changes things. It changes what people would have been doing. It changes the weather patterns. It changes the agricultural calendar. But more importantly, it raises a question that nobody wants to answer. If we were wrong about something as basic as what month the eruption happened, what else are we wrong about? Let us talk about the warnings. Because there were warnings. 17 years before Vesuvius erupted, in 62 AD, a massive earthquake hit the region. It was devastating. Buildings collapsed. Temples crumbled. The entire water system of Pompeii was damaged. Ancient sources describe it as one of the worst earthquakes in living memory. And it was not the only one. After the big quake in 62, there were smaller tremors, constantly. For 17 years, the ground shook. Wells dried up. Springs changed location. Gases started seeping from the earth. These were not subtle warning signs. These were klaxons blaring that something catastrophic was building beneath their feet. And yet, people stayed. They rebuilt. They repaired the temples. They fixed the aqueducts. Life went on. Why? Why would you rebuild a city on top of a ticking time bomb when you knew, absolutely knew, that the earth beneath you was unstable? The standard explanation is that people did not understand the connection between earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. They thought they were separate phenomena. But that does not hold up when you remember that Greek and Roman scholars had already documented volcanic eruptions in Sicily, in the Aegean, in North Africa. They knew. So, why did nobody leave? There is a psychological phenomenon called normalization of deviance. It happens when dangerous conditions become so routine that people stop perceiving them as dangerous. The first few earthquakes were terrifying, but after months of tremors, after years of minor shaking, people adapted. They got used to it. They told themselves it was just how things were now. The ground shakes sometimes. So what? You rebuild and move on. And that normalization, that adaptation to abnormality, is what killed them. But maybe there is another explanation. Maybe they did not leave because they could not leave. Pompeii was prime real estate. It was a commercial hub. People had businesses, property, investments. Walking away meant losing everything. And where would they go? Rome was crowded, expensive, and just as prone to disasters. The countryside was vulnerable to bandits and warfare. For many people in Pompeii, staying was not a choice born of ignorance. It was a calculated risk. They gambled that the mountain would stay quiet just a little longer. They lost. Now let us get into the truly strange part. There is evidence, and I want to be clear, this is contested evidence. But there is evidence that suggests Vesuvius was not alone. In 2018, researchers analyzing ice core samples from Greenland found something unexpected. The year 79 AD showed a massive spike in atmospheric sulfur, way more sulfur than Vesuvius alone could have produced. The spike was consistent with multiple volcanic eruptions happening around the same time, possibly within months of each other. And this was not just a Mediterranean phenomenon. The ice cores suggested global atmospheric disruption. What does that mean? It could mean that 79 AD was a year of volcanic hyperactivity worldwide. It could mean that whatever triggered Vesuvius was part of a larger geological event. Or, and this is where it gets genuinely unsettling, it could mean that something from outside the Earth's geological system triggered multiple eruptions simultaneously. An asteroid impact in the ocean, for example, could generate shockwaves powerful enough to destabilize volcanic systems across an entire region. It has happened before. It will happen again. And if it happened in 79 AD, then Vesuvius was not a random disaster. It was part of something much bigger. There is a theory, mostly ignored by mainstream geology, that connects Vesuvius to the Younger Dryas impact event. The Younger Dryas was a period of rapid climate cooling that happened around 12,800 years ago. The leading explanation is that a comet or asteroid broke apart in the atmosphere and created multiple impact sites across the northern hemisphere. The impacts triggered wildfires, volcanic eruptions, and an abrupt return to Ice Age conditions. Civilization, if it existed in any form at that time, would have been nearly wiped out. And here is the thing. If it happened once, there is no reason it could not happen again on a smaller scale. Could something similar have triggered Vesuvius? Could an unrecorded cosmic event in the 1st century AD have destabilized volcanic systems across the Mediterranean? We know from Chinese astronomical records that there was unusual celestial activity around that time. We know from tree ring data that the late 1st century experienced climate anomalies. We know from the Greenland ice cores that atmospheric chemistry was disrupted. But we do not have a smoking gun. We do not have a confirmed impact crater. What we have are patterns, anomalies, things that do not quite fit the story we have been told. And that brings us back to the question of why nobody saw it coming. Maybe they did. Maybe there were warnings that we do not have records of anymore. Maybe there were astronomers, philosophers, or priests who looked at the signs and said, "Something is wrong, we need to leave." But if they existed, their warnings did not make it into the historical record. Pliny the Younger wrote about the eruption, but he wrote it years later, from memory, shaped by grief and trauma. His account is valuable, but it is not objective. It is not a scientific report. It is a survivor trying to make sense of something that made no sense. What would a warning have looked like? Increased seismic activity, which they had. Changes in groundwater, which they had. Animals behaving strangely, which ancient sources mention but do not elaborate on. Gases venting from the earth, which we know was happening because the chemical composition of Pompeii's water changed in the years before the eruption. All the signs were there. But signs only matter if you know how to read them. And more importantly, if you are willing to act on them. This is where the Roman mentality becomes a liability. Roman culture valued stoicism, duty, and order. Panicking was seen as weakness. Abandoning your post was cowardice. There are accounts of Roman soldiers standing at their posts in Pompeii even as ash rained down because discipline demanded it. That is admirable in a certain context. It is also suicidal. The Romans had built a civilization on the idea that humans could impose order on chaos through willpower and engineering. And then, Vesuvius reminded them that nature does not care about human willpower. The eruption itself unfolded in stages. First came the earthquake, violent enough to collapse buildings that had survived 17 years of tremors. Then came the ash column, rising miles into the sky, blotting out the sun. Then came the pyroclastic surges, superheated clouds of gas and rock moving faster than a human could run, incinerating everything in their path. And finally, the ashfall, burying the city under 20 feet of volcanic debris. The entire sequence took less than 24 hours. By the time the sun rose the next day, Pompeii was gone. But here's what haunts me. We found bodies in positions that suggest they were still going about their daily routines when the eruption started. People at the marketplace, people in their homes, people at the baths. They were not fleeing. They were not panicking. They were just living their lives right up until the moment those lives ended. Either they did not understand what was happening until it was too late, or they understood and chose to stay anyway. I am not sure which is more tragic. And we are no different. We live on fault lines, in flood zones, in the paths of hurricanes, in the shadows of unstable mountains. We build nuclear reactors on coastlines prone to tsunamis. We pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and tell ourselves it will be fine. We see the warnings, we know the risks, and we stay anyway, because leaving is hard, because we have investments, because we tell ourselves it will not happen to us. Pompeii is not ancient history. Pompeii is a mirror, and what it reflects back at us is not comforting. Every single person reading this right now, watching this video, listening to these words, you are part of something extraordinary. You are a survivor, not just of your own personal challenges or the difficulties of modern life. You are the descendant of a genetic miracle that almost never happened. Because 70,000 years ago, the human species nearly went extinct. And the evidence for this is written in your DNA, in my DNA, in the DNA of every living human on Earth. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, gave us our first comprehensive look at human genetic diversity. What scientists found shocked them. When they compared the genetic variation between humans to the genetic variation in other species, something was wildly off. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have more genetic diversity within their species than all 8 billion humans combined. A single troop of chimps in Tanzania can have more genetic variation than exists between a person from Iceland and a person from Papua New Guinea. That should not be possible. That makes no sense unless something catastrophic happened to humanity in the relatively recent past. The numbers tell the story. Genetic models suggest that at some point between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, the entire human population was reduced to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals. Think about that. The total number of humans alive on the entire planet may have dropped to less than the population of a small town. Everyone alive today, all 8 billion of us, all our ancestors, all our descendants, we all trace back to that tiny group of survivors. We are their children. We are their legacy. We are the last colony. The leading explanation for this near-extinction event is the Toba supervolcanic eruption. Around 74,000 years ago, a volcano in what is now Indonesia exploded with a force that makes Vesuvius look like a firecracker. Toba ejected 800 cubic miles of ash and rock into the atmosphere. It triggered a volcanic winter that lasted years, possibly decades. Temperatures dropped, sunlight was blocked, plants died, animals starved, and humans, scattered across Africa and parts of Asia in small hunter-gatherer bands, were pushed to the absolute brink of extinction. But here is where it connects to Pompeii. When the University of Florence analyzed the DNA from Pompeii's victims, they found something unexpected. The genetic diversity was low, abnormally low, not just lower than modern Italian populations, but lower than you would expect from any healthy, thriving urban center in the ancient world. The pattern looked like what geneticists call a bottleneck signature. It looked like the genetic profile of a population that had gone through a severe reduction in numbers at some point in its history, lost most of its genetic variation, and then slowly recovered but never fully regained the diversity that existed before. Now, the Toba bottleneck happened 74,000 years ago. Pompeii was buried in 79 AD. There is no direct connection between those two events. But what if Pompeii was not experiencing its first bottleneck? What if the people who lived there were descendants of populations that had gone through multiple cycles of near extinction and recovery? What if the Mediterranean, this cradle of Western civilization we have been taught to revere, was actually a refuge zone where the survivors of earlier catastrophes had gathered? Let us look at other populations with similar genetic signatures. Iceland is one of the most genetically homogeneous places on Earth. The reason is simple. Iceland was settled by a small founding population in the 9th and 10th centuries, and because of its geographic isolation, that population remained relatively closed for over 1,000 years. Everyone in Iceland today descends from a few hundred founding families. Their genetic diversity is limited because their ancestral population was limited. Sardinia shows a similar pattern. The island was settled thousands of years ago, and its mountainous terrain and relative isolation meant that populations remained genetically distinct from mainland Italy. When you test Sardinian DNA, you find genetic markers that are rare or absent in other European populations. They are like a living snapshot of what Mediterranean genetics looked like thousands of years ago, before major migrations mixed everything together. And here is the fascinating part. When you compare the genetic profiles from Pompeii to modern Sardinian populations, you find similarities. Not perfect matches, but enough overlap to suggest that the people of Pompeii might have been part of a similar isolated population dynamic. They were not mixing freely with the broader Mediterranean gene pool. They were, for lack of a better term, genetically insular. And that insularity, that lack of diversity, is exactly what you would expect to see in a population descended from survivors of a catastrophic event. But it goes deeper than that. There is another concept in genetics called mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam. These are not literal individuals, but rather theoretical, most recent common ancestors. Mitochondrial Eve is the woman from whom all living humans inherited their mitochondrial DNA. Y-chromosomal Adam is the man from whom all living humans inherited their Y chromosome. And here is the shocking part. According to genetic analysis, mitochondrial Eve lived approximately 150,000 years ago. Y-chromosomal Adam lived between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. What does that mean? It means that at some point in the relatively recent past, by evolutionary standards, the entire human population was funneled through an incredibly small number of individuals. All of us, every person on Earth, can trace our maternal line back to one woman. All men can trace their paternal line back to one man. That is not how a healthy, thriving species looks genetically. That is how a species on the edge of extinction looks. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but that was a long time ago. Humans recovered. We are fine now. But what if we have been through this cycle more than once? What if human history is not a smooth upward climb from primitive to advanced, but a series of collapses and recoveries? What if civilizations rose, achieved incredible things, and then were wiped out by catastrophes, leaving only scattered survivors who had to start over from scratch? The genetic evidence from Pompeii suggests exactly that. The people who died there were not at the beginning of their civilization. They were at a high point of technological and cultural achievement. Roman engineering, art, literature, law, all of it represents a sophisticated society. And yet their DNA tells a different story. It tells a story of a population that had been through something traumatic, something that reduced their numbers and their genetic diversity, and they were still carrying the scars of that event in their chromosomes. There is a comparison worth making here. When European diseases hit the Americas in the 1500s, they killed an estimated 90% of the indigenous population. Entire civilizations collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Agricultural systems failed. And the survivors, the 10% who made it through, they carried a bottleneck signature in their DNA that is still detectable today. Geneticists can look at Native American populations and see the genetic impact of that catastrophe written in their genes. It happened 500 years ago, and it is still visible. Now, imagine that happening not once, but multiple times over tens of thousands of years. Imagine a species that keeps getting knocked down to a few thousand survivors, rebuilding, reaching a certain level of complexity, and then getting knocked down again. What would that look like? It would look like us. It would look like a species with remarkably low genetic diversity for how widespread we are. It would look like a species with deep genetic memories of catastrophe. It would look like a species that has been to the edge of extinction and back so many times that we carry the trauma in our very biology. And this brings us to the uncomfortable question. If Pompeii was a colony, a settlement of survivors from an earlier catastrophe, then what was the original homeland? Where did these people come from before they ended up in the shadow of Vesuvius? The genetic markers point to the Middle East, to North Africa, to isolated pockets throughout the Mediterranean. But those markers themselves are ancient. They suggest that the people carrying them had been isolated for a very long time before showing up in Italy. One possibility, and this is speculative but worth considering, is that the Mediterranean basin was a refuge during the last ice age. When glaciers covered northern Europe and much of Asia, the Mediterranean remained relatively warm and habitable. Populations that had been scattered across Europe and the Middle East would have been pushed south, funneled into the narrow band of livable territory around the Mediterranean Sea. They would have mixed, interbred, and formed a genetically distinct population. And when the ice retreated and humans spread back out across Europe, some populations stayed. They remained in the Mediterranean, maintaining their genetic distinctiveness, their cultural traditions, their ancient knowledge. Pompeii could have been one of the last holdouts of that ancient Mediterranean population, a place where people who carried genetic memories of Ice Age refuges, of Younger Dryas catastrophes, of repeated brushes with extinction, continued to live and thrive, until Vesuvius reminded them that the cycle was not over, that the catastrophes that nearly wiped out humanity 70,000 years ago could happen again at any time. And here is the truly unsettling part. We are still living through that cycle. The genetic bottleneck that humanity experienced is not ancient history. It is recent history by evolutionary standards. We have not had enough time to rebuild our genetic diversity. We are still, in a very real sense, an endangered species pretending to be dominant. Our numbers are high, but our genetic variation is dangerously low. One well-placed catastrophe, one global pandemic, one asteroid impact, one supervolcanic eruption, and we could be right back to a few thousand survivors trying to rebuild civilization from scratch. Pompeii is not just a story about the past. It is a warning about the future, because the people who died there were not genetically prepared for catastrophe. They had survived previous bottlenecks, but each one left them more vulnerable, more genetically fragile. And we are in the same position. We have the illusion of security because there are billions of us. But billions do not matter if we all share the same vulnerabilities, the same limited genetic toolkit, the same biological weaknesses. We are a colony at the edge of survival, and we always have been. Pompeii just made it visible. Walk through the ruins of Pompeii today, and you will see something that does not quite add up. The tour guides will show you the baths, the aqueducts, the elaborate plumbing systems. They will tell you, look at how advanced the Romans were. Look at what they built. But if you know what to look for, if you actually understand ancient engineering, you start to notice details that should not exist. Techniques that the Romans, according to every historical record we have, should not have known how to do. And that is when you realize that maybe, just maybe, they did not build it at all. Maybe they just inherited it. Let us start with the water system. Pompeii had running water. Not just public fountains, but private homes with indoor plumbing. Lead pipes carried water from the main aqueduct into individual buildings. Now, lead pipes are not unusual for Roman engineering. What is unusual is how they were made. When modern metallurgists examined the lead pipes from Pompeii, they found something strange. The seams were welded using a technique that requires precise temperature control and an understanding of metallurgy that should not have existed in the 1st century AD. Roman lead working was primitive by comparison. They typically hammered lead sheets around wooden forms and sealed the seams with molten lead poured into grooves. It worked, but it was crude, and the joints were weak points prone to leaking. The pipes in Pompeii were different. The welds were seamless, stronger than the surrounding metal, showing no signs of the stress fractures you would expect from primitive welding techniques. When researchers tried to replicate the process using only tools and techniques available to 1st century Romans, they could not do it. The welds failed. The joints leaked. Whatever method was used to create those pipes, it was not standard Roman engineering. So where did it come from? The conventional answer is that the Romans must have had specialized craftsmen with secret techniques passed down through guilds. That is possible, but it does not explain why this level of precision welding only shows up in certain locations, particularly in Campania, particularly in cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum. If it was a Roman technique, you would expect to see it everywhere. You do not. You see it in places that were inhabited long before Rome conquered them. Now let us talk about concrete. Roman concrete is famous. It is one of the great achievements of ancient engineering. The Pantheon Dome, still standing after 2,000 years, is made of Roman concrete. But here is what most people do not know. Roman concrete from Pompeii is different from Roman concrete in Rome. In 2018, researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, analyzed samples of concrete from multiple sites across the Roman Empire. What they found was that Pompeii's concrete contained nanocrystals, microscopic calcium aluminum silicate hydrate structures that actively self-healed cracks as they formed. This is not something the Romans intentionally engineered. This is something that happened because of the specific mixture of volcanic ash, lime, and seawater used in the concrete. But here's the thing. To get that specific mixture, to produce concrete with self-healing properties, you need to understand chemistry at a level that the Romans absolutely did not have. They did not have atomic theory. They did not have microscopes. They did not have the ability to analyze materials at the molecular level. And yet, somehow, they created a material that modern engineers are still trying to fully replicate. The most logical explanation is that they did not invent it. They copied it. They found structures built by an earlier civilization, analyzed the materials through trial and error, and reproduced the technique without fully understanding why it worked. And when the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, that knowledge was lost. For over 1,000 years, nobody in Europe knew how to make concrete. The recipe vanished. It was not rediscovered until the 18th century, and even then, modern concrete does not have the durability of the Roman original. But if the Romans were copying someone else's technique, who were they copying? The Etruscans are the obvious answer. Etruscan engineering was highly advanced. They built sophisticated drainage systems, underground tombs, and defensive walls, using techniques that predate Roman construction by centuries. But even Etruscan engineering does not fully explain what we see in Pompeii, because some of the infrastructure in Pompeii is built into the bedrock, into geological layers that predate any known Etruscan settlement. Let me give you a specific example. In 2015, ground-penetrating radar surveys of Pompeii revealed a network of underground chambers and tunnels that had never been excavated. Some of these tunnels extend beneath the oldest known structures in the city. When archaeologists finally accessed one of these chambers, they found stonework that did not match any known Roman or Etruscan style. The blocks were larger, more precisely cut, and fit together with almost no mortar. The technique resembled megalithic construction seen in places like Sacsayhuaman in Peru or the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Massive stones, precisely fitted, designed to last for millennia. Why would anyone build like that in Pompeii? If you are building a house or a shop, you do not need massive stone blocks fitted with millimeter precision. You need functional structures built quickly and cheaply. But if you are building something meant to survive catastrophes, if you are building something meant to last through earthquakes and floods and volcanic eruptions, then you build like this. You build like you expect the world to end and you want your work to survive it. And then there are the multi-story apartment buildings. Pompeii had them, insulae, the Romans called them. But here's the problem. Roman insulae were notoriously dangerous. They collapsed regularly because Roman construction techniques were not sophisticated enough to safely build tall structures. Rome itself had constant building collapses. Fires spreading through poorly constructed apartment blocks were a regular occurrence. The Emperor Augustus had to pass laws limiting building height because it was such a problem. And yet, in Pompeii, you have multi-story buildings that survive for decades, maybe centuries, without collapsing. How? The answer is in the foundations. Pompeii's apartment buildings were built on foundations that go deep into the ground, foundations that use weight distribution techniques that would not be formally understood until the development of modern structural engineering. Someone knew how to calculate load-bearing capacity. Someone understood how to transfer weight through a structure to prevent collapse, and that someone was not supposed to exist in the 1st century AD. There is a site in Pompeii called the Villa of the Mysteries. It is famous for its frescoes, but what most tourists do not notice is the floor. It is a mosaic made of millions of tiny colored stones, arranged in complex geometric patterns. The precision is extraordinary. Each stone is cut to fit perfectly with its neighbors. There are no gaps, no unevenness. The entire floor is level to within a few millimeters across its entire surface. To create something like that, you need surveying tools, you need mathematics, you need an understanding of geometry that goes beyond basic Roman education. And here is the thing. The Villa of the Mysteries was not a public building. It was a private home. If this level of engineering was available for a private residence, what was being built in the public spaces? What was being built in the temples and government buildings that we have not fully excavated yet? At this point, if you are thinking that mainstream archaeology is missing something huge here, you are absolutely right. And if you want to keep exploring the evidence that does not fit the standard narrative, you need to subscribe to Tales Before Tesla. Hit that notification bell, because we are going to keep digging into the infrastructure, the technology, and the knowledge that ancient civilizations had and somehow lost. This is not pseudo-archaeology. This is real evidence that demands better explanations than what we have been given. Now let us talk about the Thermopolium. These were fast food restaurants, basically ancient snack bars where people could buy hot meals. Pompeii had dozens of them. And when engineers analyzed their design, they found something remarkable. The counters were built with precise thermal management. Hot food was kept in recessed containers that were heated from below using a system of channels that distributed heat evenly. The design is thermodynamically efficient in ways that suggest whoever built it understood heat transfer, convection, and temperature control at a sophisticated level. Could the Romans have figured this out through trial and error? Sure, but trial and error takes generations. You build something, it does not work quite right. You modify it, you test it again, eventually you get it right. But the Thermopolia in Pompeii all use the same design. There is no evidence of experimental versions or failed prototypes. It is as if someone showed up with the finished blueprint and said, "Build it like this," and everyone did. That pattern repeats throughout Pompeii. Advanced techniques appearing fully formed with no developmental history. It is the same thing we see at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, where massive stone temples appear suddenly in the archaeological record with no preceding simpler versions. It is the same thing we see at Pumapunku in Bolivia, where stone blocks are cut with such precision that they appear to have been machined. Advanced technology showing up too early, in places where it should not exist, built by people who allegedly did not have the knowledge to create it. The standard explanation is always the same. Ancient people were smarter than we give them credit for. They had techniques we have lost. They achieved things through ingenuity and hard work, and all of that is true. But it does not explain the consistency of the anomalies. It does not explain why the same impossible techniques show up in different places, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Unless, of course, they were all inheriting knowledge from the same source. Unless there was a parent civilization, older and more advanced, that seeded technology across the ancient world before it vanished. Pompeii might not have been the origin of that technology, but it was definitely a repository, a place where ancient knowledge was preserved, practiced, and passed down, until Vesuvius buried it all. And now we are left with ruins that raise more questions than they answer. Structures that should not exist, techniques we cannot replicate, evidence of a past that was far more sophisticated than the history books admit. In 1961, archaeologists excavating a wealthy Pompeii home made a discovery that should have rewritten our understanding of ancient trade. Inside a locked wooden chest, preserved by the volcanic ash, they found silk, not Roman fabric, not Egyptian linen. Silk, real Chinese silk, with weaving patterns that matched textiles from the Han Dynasty. The fabric had traveled over 5,000 miles from workshops in Chang'an, across the mountains and deserts of Central Asia, through Parthian territories hostile to Rome, past countless bandits and border checkpoints, to end up in the closet of someone's house in Pompeii. That is not a trade route, that is a highway. The Silk Road is usually presented as a medieval phenomenon, something that really got going during the Mongol Empire or the Tang Dynasty. But the evidence from Pompeii proves it was fully operational in the 1st century AD, and silk was not the only thing moving. Ivory from East Africa, amber from the Baltic coast, spices from India, glass beads from Mesopotamia. Pompeii was not just connected to the Mediterranean trade network, it was connected to the entire known world. And that raises a question nobody wants to answer. How? Roman ships were good, but they were not that good. A typical merchant vessel could carry maybe 200 tons of cargo and had to stay within sight of the coast because navigational technology was limited. The Romans did not have compasses. They did not have accurate maps. They navigated by landmarks and star positions and sheer experience. Long-distance ocean voyages were dangerous, expensive, and frequently fatal. So how did goods from China, from sub-Saharan Africa, from the far reaches of the Indian Ocean, end up in a mid-sized Italian city with such regularity that wealthy families just casually owned them? The answer is that Rome was not doing this alone. There was already a network, a massive, sophisticated, multi-civilizational trade system that predated Rome by centuries, possibly millennia. The Romans did not build it, they plugged into it. They became one node in a web of exchange that stretched from Britain to China, from Scandinavia to Zanzibar. And Pompeii, because of its location on the Bay of Naples, became a critical hub in that network. But here's where it gets interesting. When researchers analyzed the skeletal remains from Pompeii using isotope analysis, which can determine where a person spent their childhood based on the minerals in their bones and teeth, they found that a significant percentage of the population was not born there. People from North Africa, people from the Eastern Mediterranean, people from as far away as the Black Sea coast. Pompeii was cosmopolitan in a way that should not have been possible for a city of its size. Rome itself, sure. Rome was the capital of an empire. You would expect diversity there. But Pompeii was a provincial city, a resort town, a place where wealthy Romans went on vacation. It should have been demographically homogeneous, mostly local Campanians, with a small administrative class of Roman officials. Instead, it was a melting pot. People from all over the ancient world were living there, working there, dying there. Why? One possibility is that Pompeii was a trading post long before it became a Roman city. The harbor at Pompeii was not large, but it was strategically located. Ships coming from the east, from Greece or Egypt or the Levant, would naturally stop there before continuing up the coast to Rome. Goods would be offloaded, stored, repackaged, and sent onward. Merchants would settle nearby to facilitate transactions. Over time, the trading post would grow into a city, and that city would naturally attract people from all the places it traded with. But there is another possibility, one that fits better with the genetic evidence we discussed earlier. What if Pompeii was not just a random trading hub? What if it was a deliberate colony, a settlement established by a consortium of Mediterranean civilizations for the explicit purpose of facilitating long-distance trade? The Phoenicians did this all over the Mediterranean. They established trading colonies in Spain, North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia. Carthage, one of Rome's greatest rivals, started as a Phoenician trading post. What if Pompeii had a similar origin? The Phoenicians were the great navigators of the ancient world. They sailed beyond the Strait of Gibraltar into the Atlantic. They circumnavigated Africa. There are even controversial theories, supported by some archaeological evidence, that they reached the Americas. Phoenician DNA is widespread throughout the Mediterranean. Genetic studies have found Phoenician markers in populations from Lebanon to Tunisia to Spain to the islands of the Atlantic. They were everywhere. They connected everything. And they left very few written records, so most of what they did is invisible to history. Now, here is the uncomfortable part. Roman historians hated the Phoenicians. After Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BC, they systematically erased Phoenician culture from the historical record. Carthaginian libraries were burned. Their language was suppressed. Their achievements were attributed to other civilizations. It was cultural annihilation. So if Pompeii had Phoenician origins, if it started as a Phoenician trading colony and only later became Romanized, we would not know. That history would have been deliberately erased. But the genetic evidence does not lie. The DNA from Pompeii shows connections to populations across the entire Mediterranean basin. The artifacts tell the same story. Chinese silk, African ivory, Baltic amber. These are not random trade goods. They are evidence of a coordinated, long-distance exchange network that required cooperation between multiple civilizations. The Romans liked to pretend they controlled everything, but the truth is they were latecomers to a system that already existed. And that system was old, really old. Obsidian from the island of Melos has been found at mainland Greek sites dating back 9,000 years. Copper from Cyprus was being traded throughout the eastern Mediterranean in the Bronze Age. Tin from Cornwall in Britain was being shipped to the Middle East to make bronze 3,000 years ago. These trade routes were ancient even when Rome was founded. They survived the Bronze Age collapse. They survived the Sea People's invasions. They survived every disaster and every empire that rose and fell around them, because the network was more important than any individual civilization. Think about what that means. It means there was a time when human civilization was more interconnected than the history books admit, when knowledge, technology, and goods flowed freely between cultures that were supposedly isolated from each other. When someone in Pompeii could own silk from China not as a rare treasure, but as a normal luxury item. When a merchant in Rome could source ivory from East Africa, amber from the Baltic, and spices from India, all from the same market. And then that network collapsed. After the fall of Rome, long-distance trade nearly disappeared from Europe. The Mediterranean, which had been a highway for millennia, became a barrier. Cities that had thrived on trade were abandoned. Knowledge that had been shared across continents was lost. For 500 years, Europe entered a dark age, while other parts of the world, particularly the Islamic world and China, continued to thrive. But even they never quite rebuilt the global network that had existed in the Roman era. It was not until the Age of Exploration, over 1,000 years later, that European trade routes reached the same level of interconnectedness. What happened? The standard explanation is that political instability and the collapse of imperial authority made long-distance trade too dangerous. But that does not explain why the network never fully recovered. Empires rose and fell before Rome, and the trade routes survived. Something else happened. Something that broke the system in a way it had never been broken before. If you are watching this from anywhere around the Mediterranean, drop a comment and let me know. Does your family have any old stories, any traditions that talk about ancestors who traveled, who traded, who came from somewhere else? Because there is a very real chance that your genetic lineage includes people who passed through Pompeii, who were part of that ancient network. The Mediterranean was never a collection of isolated civilizations. It was one interconnected world. And we are the descendants of the people who built it. There is one more piece of evidence worth mentioning. In 1950, a Roman coin was allegedly found in Venezuela. In 1963, another was found in Tennessee. In 2015, a shipwreck off the coast of Brazil was discovered with Roman amphorae. These finds are controversial. Many archaeologists dismiss them as hoaxes or misidentifications. But if even one of them is genuine, if even one Roman artifact made it to the Americas before Columbus, then everything we think we know about ancient navigation is wrong. The Phoenicians had the ships. They had the navigational knowledge. They had the motivation. If they could circumnavigate Africa, if they could reach Britain and possibly Iceland, then the Atlantic crossing would not have been impossible. Difficult, yes. Deadly, probably, but not impossible. And if they did it, they would not have written about it, because trade routes were secrets. Monopolies were maintained through information control. If you discovered a new source of valuable resources, the last thing you would do is publish a detailed account of how to get there. So maybe the Mediterranean network was not just Mediterranean. Maybe it was global. Maybe there were shipping lanes, seasonal routes, island-hopping paths that connected the old world to the new world long before we have any written record of it. And maybe Pompeii, this city that had silk from China and ivory from Africa, was also a terminus for goods coming from across the Atlantic. We will never know for sure, because Vesuvius buried the evidence, but the possibility is there, sitting in the gaps of history, waiting for someone to prove it. Pliny the Younger watched Vesuvius erupt from across the Bay of Naples. He was 17 years old, staying with his uncle Pliny the Elder at the Roman naval base in Misenum. His uncle, the famous naturalist and commander of the fleet, sailed toward the eruption to investigate and rescue people. He never came back. But Pliny the Younger survived, and 25 years later, he wrote 2 letters describing what he had witnessed. Those letters are the only eyewitness account we have of Pompeii's destruction, and buried in his carefully chosen words is something he does not quite say directly. Many people escaped. He writes about ships filled with refugees fleeing the coast. He describes crowds of people running inland, away from the ash cloud and the surges. He mentions that his uncle rescued some individuals before the situation became fatal. Pliny makes it clear that Pompeii was not a complete massacre. It was a disaster with survivors. So where did they go? What happened to the thousands of people who made it out alive? And more importantly, what did they know? In 2021, archaeologists surveyed an area about 15 miles north of Pompeii, near modern-day Nola. What they found were the remains of what can only be described as refugee camps, temporary structures, hastily built shelters, and artifacts that matched the style and period of Pompeii. Broken pottery with the same manufacturer marks as pieces found in Pompeii homes. Coins minted in the same year. Personal items, jewelry, household goods, the kinds of things you would grab if you had minutes to evacuate your home before it was buried forever. These were not planned settlements. These were emergency encampments, places where displaced people tried to rebuild their lives after losing everything. The structures were crude, nothing like the sophisticated buildings of Pompeii. These people went from multi-story homes with running water and heated floors to living in wooden shacks with dirt floors. The fall from civilization to survival must have been psychologically devastating, but they survived, and their descendants are still here. Genetic research published in 2023 traced mitochondrial DNA lineages in modern Italian populations and found direct connections to individuals buried in Pompeii. Not distant ancestral connections, but direct maternal lines that survived the eruption and continued unbroken to the present day. Some families living in Campania today are the literal descendants of Pompeii survivors. They carry the same mitochondrial markers. They are the genetic continuation of a city that was supposed to have been obliterated. But here is what is strange. There are almost no written records from these survivors. No memoirs, no detailed accounts, no preserved testimonies beyond Pliny's letters. You would think that people who survived one of the most catastrophic disasters in ancient history would want to document what happened. You would expect to find inscriptions, dedications, tomb epitaphs mentioning the eruption. But there is almost nothing. It is as if someone decided that the story of Pompeii should end with the eruption, and anyone who survived should stay silent about it. Was this just trauma? Did survivors choose not to talk about it because the memories were too painful? That is possible. Post-traumatic silence is a real phenomenon. But there is another explanation. What if they were told not to talk? What if Roman authorities, for reasons we can only speculate about, discouraged or actively suppressed survivor testimonies? Think about what those survivors knew. They knew that there had been warnings, 17 years of earthquakes, changes in the water supply, animals behaving strangely. They knew that Roman officials had done nothing, no evacuation plans, no emergency preparations, no public warnings. When Vesuvius erupted, the population of Pompeii was caught completely unprepared, not because the signs were absent, but because nobody in power took them seriously. That is a political scandal. That is the kind of thing that could undermine public confidence in Roman governance. If survivors started talking, if they started publicly asking why nobody warned them, why nobody helped them, why the empire they paid taxes to left them to die, it could have sparked unrest. So, the simplest solution would be to encourage silence. Provide financial assistance to refugees on the condition that they resettle quietly. Offer land grants far from Pompeii where they could rebuild without attracting attention. And ensure that no official records were kept that might raise uncomfortable questions about governmental negligence. But some survivors must have kept their own records. They must have written down what they saw, what they experienced, what they lost. Where are those documents now? The most likely answer is the Vatican Secret Archives. Now officially called the Vatican Apostolic Archives, but everyone still calls them the Secret Archives because that name is more accurate. 35 miles of shelving, 85 kilometers, 53 miles if you convert it. Documents dating back over 1,000 years, and possibly much older. Access is heavily restricted. Only qualified scholars can request to see specific documents, and even then, only after extensive vetting. What is in there? Officially, church correspondence, papal decrees, diplomatic records, financial documents. But historians who have been granted access have found far more than that. Ancient manuscripts confiscated during the Inquisition, scientific treatises banned by the church, historical accounts that contradicted official doctrine. The archives are not just a library. They are a filter, a place where information that the church wanted preserved but not publicized could be stored indefinitely. Is it possible that survivor testimonies from Pompeii ended up there? Absolutely. The Catholic Church has been the dominant cultural institution in Italy for 2,000 years. Any documents considered sensitive, controversial, or theologically problematic would have been collected and archived. If survivors wrote accounts that mentioned divine signs being ignored, or that questioned why God allowed the disaster, or that preserved pre-Christian religious practices from Pompeii, the church would have taken a very keen interest in controlling those narratives. There is a parallel here worth mentioning. In 79 AD, the same year Vesuvius erupted, the Romans were finishing their destruction of Jerusalem. The Second Temple had been demolished 9 years earlier. Jewish refugees were scattered across the empire. The early Christian movement was just beginning to spread. It was a moment of profound religious and cultural upheaval, and in the middle of all this chaos, Pompeii was buried. A city known for its religious diversity, its temples to foreign gods, its integration of Greek, Etruscan, and Roman spiritual practices, suddenly gone. Did anyone at the time see a connection? Did anyone interpret the destruction of Pompeii as divine judgment or as a sign of larger cosmic shifts? We do not know, because those interpretations, if they existed, were not preserved in the historical record. But they might still exist in the Vatican archives, waiting for someone with the right access and the right questions to find them. Now, let us talk about Herculaneum. It was Pompeii's neighbor, a smaller but wealthier town that was also buried by Vesuvius. But Herculaneum was buried differently. Instead of ash and pumice, it was hit by pyroclastic flows that carbonized everything instantly. Wood, papyrus, food, cloth, even human brains, turned into carbon but retained their structure. And in one villa, the Villa of the Papyri, archaeologists found an entire library. Thousands of scrolls, too fragile to unroll, too damaged to read. For over 200 years, those scrolls sat in museums, useless. Then, in the 21st century, new imaging technology changed everything. X-ray phase contrast tomography, machine learning algorithms, AI-assisted text recognition. Scientists can now read the scrolls without physically opening them, and what they are finding is extraordinary. Philosophical treatises, lost works by known authors, completely unknown texts by authors we have never heard of. The Villa of the Papyri is giving us access to knowledge that was supposed to be lost forever. But here's the question. If one small villa contained thousands of scrolls, how much more was lost in the rest of Pompeii and Herculaneum? How many libraries? How many private collections? How many archives were buried and have never been found? The answer is almost certainly thousands more scrolls, tens of thousands of documents, an entire lost corpus of ancient literature, history, science, and philosophy, still sitting underground, waiting to be discovered. And some of those documents might be survivor testimonies, personal letters written after the evacuation, diaries describing the experience, records kept by refugee communities. Those documents could still exist, carbonized and preserved, somewhere beneath the modern cities built on top of the ancient ruins. Every time construction crews dig a foundation in Naples or Pompeii, there is a chance they will hit an undiscovered structure, and inside that structure, there might be answers. The survivors of Pompeii carried something with them, not just physical possessions, but knowledge. They remembered how their city worked, how the water systems functioned, how the buildings were constructed, how the trade networks operated. They remembered the old gods, the old languages, the old ways that Rome had tried to erase. And they passed that knowledge down to their children, who passed it to their children, generation after generation, until eventually it became family tradition, local folklore, half-remembered stories that nobody quite believed anymore. But the genetic evidence proves the lineage is real. The descendants of Pompeii are still here, which means the knowledge, in some form, might still be here too. Fragmented, distorted, wrapped in myth and legend, but not entirely gone. And if we can find those descendants, if we can collect their family stories and compare them to the archaeological evidence, we might be able to reconstruct what the survivors knew. We might be able to hear their voices again, 20 centuries after Vesuvius tried to silence them forever. Look at your hands. Right now, just look at them. The skin, the bone structure, the fingerprints that are uniquely yours. That physical form you inhabit is the product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, migration, survival, and adaptation. But it is also the product of bottlenecks, catastrophes, moments when almost everyone died and only a tiny fraction of humanity made it through. Your existence is not inevitable. It is miraculous. You are the descendant of survivors who should not have survived. And the genetic evidence from Pompeii proves that this pattern, this cycle of near extinction and recovery, is not ancient history. It is ongoing. It is us. Every person of European descent carries genetic material that can be traced back to Mediterranean populations like Pompeii. The migrations that populated Europe after the last ice age came through the Mediterranean corridor. The agricultural revolution that spread across Europe originated in the Near East and moved through coastal trade routes. The genetic mixing that created modern European populations happened in cities exactly like Pompeii, places where different lineages came together, intermarried, and created something new. Pompeii was not an outlier. It was a representative sample, a snapshot of what humanity looked like at a critical moment in our development. And what that snapshot shows is fragility. The people of Pompeii had access to advanced technology. They had running water, heated floors, sophisticated architecture, global trade networks, medical knowledge, literature, art, everything we associate with an advanced civilization, and it all disappeared in less than 24 hours. One volcanic eruption, one geological event, and an entire city was erased. Not just destroyed, but buried so completely that it was forgotten for over 1,600 years. If that could happen to them, with all their achievements, what makes us think it could not happen to us? We have the same vulnerabilities they did. We live in geologically active zones. We build cities on coastlines prone to tsunamis and hurricanes. We depend on supply chains that can be disrupted by a single choke point failure. We have concentrated our population in urban centers that would be death traps in a real crisis. And most dangerously, we have convinced ourselves that technology has made us invulnerable. We think that because we have satellites and weather prediction models and emergency alert systems, we are safe, but Pompeii had warning systems too. They had 17 years of earthquakes. They had all the data they needed. And they still died, because having information and acting on it are two completely different things. COVID-19 should have taught us this lesson. A respiratory virus, something humanity has dealt with for millennia, brought modern civilization to its knees. Global supply chains collapsed. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Governments struggled to coordinate responses. Millions died. And that was just a pandemic. Something we knew was possible. Something we had plans for. Imagine if it had been something worse. Imagine if it had been a Carrington event-level solar flare that wiped out electrical grids worldwide. Imagine if it had been a supervolcanic eruption like Toba. Imagine if it had been an asteroid impact. How many of us would survive? How much of our knowledge would be preserved? The uncomfortable truth is that most of what we consider essential to modern life exists in formats that are incredibly fragile. Digital data can be erased by electromagnetic pulses. Cloud servers require constant power and maintenance. Physical books are printed in smaller and smaller quantities as everything moves online. If the electrical grid failed permanently, if the internet went dark, if supply chains broke down, how much of human knowledge would be accessible? How many people know how to grow food, purify water, build shelter, create medicine from raw materials? We have outsourced survival skills to systems and institutions, and if those systems fail, most of us would not last a month. Pompeii is what happens when a civilization assumes continuity, when people believe that tomorrow will be basically like today, just with minor improvements. The people of Pompeii went to bed on October 23rd, 79 AD, thinking they would wake up the next morning, go to work, have dinner with their families, and continue their lives as normal. Some of them had plans for the following week. Some of them had long-term investments in property or businesses. Some of them were saving money for their children's education. And all of those plans, all of those assumptions about the future, became irrelevant in the span of a few hours. We are doing the same thing. We assume that the systems we depend on will keep functioning. We assume that governments will maintain order, that corporations will deliver goods, that infrastructure will hold together. But all of those assumptions are built on the stability of the environment, and the environment is not stable. It has never been stable. Climate shifts, geological events, cosmic impacts, pandemics, these are not anomalies. They are features of living on an active planet orbiting a volatile star in a chaotic universe. The anomaly is the periods of calm between disasters. We are living in one of those calm periods right now. And like the people of Pompeii, we have mistaken temporary stability for permanent safety. But here's the thing. We have something Pompeii did not have. We have their example. We can see what happened when a civilization failed to prepare, failed to evacuate, failed to take warnings seriously. We can study the ruins and understand exactly how quickly everything can fall apart. That knowledge is a gift, but only if we use it. Only if we stop pretending that disasters happen to other people in other times and recognize that we are just as vulnerable as they were. The genetic bottleneck that reduced humanity to a few thousand individuals 70,000 years ago is still visible in our DNA. We have not had enough generations to fully recover our diversity. That makes us vulnerable to species-wide extinction events. A single pandemic with the right characteristics could kill billions. A single asteroid impact in the wrong location could trigger a nuclear winter. A single supervolcanic eruption could make large portions of the Earth uninhabitable. And unlike 70,000 years ago, when humans were scattered in small bands across Africa and Asia, we are now concentrated in cities, dependent on technology, and genetically homogeneous enough that a pathogen optimized for one population could potentially threaten all populations. Pompeii shows us that the cycle has not ended. Civilizations rise, they flourish, they convince themselves they are permanent, and then they are swept away. Sometimes by human conflict, sometimes by natural disaster, sometimes by a combination of both. The specifics change, but the pattern remains. And we are currently at the peak of our cycle. We have more people, more technology, more complexity than any civilization in history, which means we have further to fall. But it does not have to be this way. The survivors of Pompeii, the refugees who fled to Nola and other settlements, they rebuilt. It took generations, and they never fully recovered what was lost. But they survived. They passed on their knowledge, their genetics, their cultural memory. They became the ancestors of modern Italians. The lineage continued. And that is the most important thing. Not whether civilization survives in its current form, but whether humanity survives. Whether we, as a species, can adapt quickly enough to make it through the next bottleneck. So, if you are watching this, if you have made it this far, I need you to understand something. You are not a passive observer of history. You are an active participant in the survival of the species. The choices you make, the knowledge you preserve, the skills you develop, the community connections you build, all of that matters. Because when the next disaster comes, and it will come, the survivors will be the people who prepared, who stayed informed, who did not assume that someone else would handle it. Subscribe to Tales Before Tesla, not just because you want to see more content like this, but because preserving and sharing knowledge is how we prevent the cycle from repeating. Every person who understands what happened to Pompeii, who learns from their mistakes, who takes the warnings seriously, is one more person who might survive the next catastrophe. And enough individuals making better choices can shift the odds for the entire species. The last colony theory is not just about the past. It is about the future. It is about recognizing that we are always one disaster away from becoming a remnant population, struggling to preserve what remains of our civilization. Pompeii was buried for 1700 years before it was rediscovered. How many other cities, how many other civilizations are buried right now, waiting to be found? How many cycles of rise and fall have already happened that we know nothing about? There is a concept in archaeology called the urban myth of progress. It is the idea that human civilization moves in a straight line from primitive to advanced, that every generation is smarter and more capable than the one before. But the evidence does not support that. The evidence shows cycles, periods of advancement followed by collapse, knowledge gained and then lost, technologies developed and then forgotten. Pompeii had concrete that we still cannot fully replicate. They had medical techniques that were not rediscovered until the Renaissance. They had urban planning that modern cities struggle to match. They were not primitive. They were us. And they failed to survive. So the question is not whether we are more advanced than Pompeii. The question is whether we are wiser, whether we have learned from their mistakes, whether we will see the warnings and act on them, or whether we will do what they did and assume that the mountain will stay quiet, that the ground will stop shaking, that tomorrow will come just like it always has. If Pompeii was buried for 1700 years before we found it again, what else is buried? What other cities are under our feet, waiting to tell their stories? And when the next catastrophe comes, when our cities are buried under ash or water or sand, what will future archaeologists think when they dig us up? Will they see a civilization that learned from the past? Or will they see another Pompeii, another group of people who had all the information they needed and chose to ignore it? We are the evidence. We are the last colony. And the story is not over yet.